The morning sun streamed through my kitchen window as I stood at the counter, staring at an empty mailbox key in my trembling hand. For weeks, I'd been expecting crucial test results from my cardiologist, but nothing had arrived. At 59, heart palpitations weren't something I could ignore, especially after my recent scare that landed me in the emergency room. The silence from my doctor's office felt deafening. I'd called Dr. Martinez's office 3 times, only to be told the same thing each time. "Mrs. White, we mailed your results 2 weeks ago. You should have received them by now." But my mailbox had been strangely empty of anything important lately, containing only junk mail and grocery store flyers. Before we dive into this unbelievable tale, please like and subscribe. I read every comment, so tell me where you're from. My name is Margaret White. I'm 59 years old, and I never imagined I'd be sharing a story like this about my own family. Living in the same quiet neighborhood in Ohio for over 30 years, I thought I knew everyone I could trust. My sister Linda Patterson, who's 56, had been coming by more frequently over the past few months, always offering to help with little things around the house. She'd even volunteered to check my mail when I was recovering from a minor procedure last month, which I thought was incredibly thoughtful at the time. My daughter, Jessica White, who's 32 and works as a nurse practitioner, had been my rock through all my recent health concerns. She lived just 20 minutes away and made it a point to call every other day to check on me. Jessica had inherited her father's analytical mind and was always asking detailed questions about my medical care, making sure I was staying on top of everything. Then there was my longtime friend and neighbor, Patricia Murphy. Pat had lived across the street for 15 years, and we'd developed the kind of friendship where we could rely on each other for anything. She was the type of person who noticed everything happening in the neighborhood and had a gift for reading people's true intentions. The whole situation started to unravel on a Tuesday morning when I bumped into Dr. Martinez at the grocery store. His face lit up when he saw me, and he asked how I was feeling since receiving my test results. When I told him I'd never gotten them, his expression shifted to genuine concern. He assured me they'd been mailed to my home address 3 weeks prior, along with a referral to a specialist that required urgent attention. That afternoon, I called Jessica in a panic. "Honey, something's not right," I told her as I paced around my living room, my heart racing with anxiety. "Dr. Martinez says he mailed important results weeks ago, but I haven't seen anything." Jessica's voice immediately took on that professional tone she used when she was problem-solving. "Mom, that's really strange. Have you been getting your other mail normally? Bills, magazines, that kind of thing?" I paused, thinking back over the past month. "Actually, now that you mention it, I haven't gotten my usual bank statements or insurance correspondence either. But Linda's been helping me sort through the mail pile on busy days." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Jessica and Linda had never been particularly close, and I could practically hear my daughter's wheels turning. "Mom, I think we need to look into this more carefully. Missing medical information isn't something we can just brush off." That evening, Patricia stopped by with a plate of her famous chocolate chip cookies, but I could tell she had something else on her mind. We sat on my front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in soft oranges and pinks when she finally spoke up. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind me mentioning this, but I've noticed Linda coming by quite a bit lately," Patricia said carefully, her weathered hands wrapped around her coffee mug. "Sometimes when you're not even home. I saw her at your mailbox last Thursday morning, and you'd already left for your physical therapy appointment." My stomach dropped. Linda had never mentioned stopping by when I wasn't home, and she certainly hadn't said anything about collecting my mail that day. I'd specifically told her I was going to be out all morning for therapy. "Are you sure it was Thursday?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Patricia nodded. "Positive. I was watering my front garden around 10, and I saw her walk up to your mailbox, take everything out, and then go inside your house. She was there for about 20 minutes before leaving with what looked like a stack of mail in her hand. The pieces were starting to form a picture I didn't want to see. Linda had a key to my house for emergencies, something I'd given her years ago when she was going through her divorce, and I wanted her to feel like she always had a safe place to go. But using that key to enter my home and take my mail when I wasn't there felt like a complete violation of trust. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to my mail delivery patterns. I made note of what time the postal carrier usually arrived and began checking my mailbox immediately afterward. What I discovered made my blood run cold. I was receiving mail, but only certain pieces. Personal letters and anything that looked official or medical seemed to be missing entirely. When I confronted Linda about it over coffee at her apartment, she became defensive immediately. "Margaret, I can't believe you're accusing me of stealing your mail," she said, her voice rising. "I've been trying to help you manage things because you've seemed so overwhelmed with all your health issues lately." But something in her eyes told a different story. She wouldn't meet my gaze directly, and she kept fidgeting with her coffee cup in a way that reminded me of when we were children and she'd been caught in a lie. "Linda, I'm not trying to attack you," I said gently. "I just need to know what happened to my medical results. Dr. Martinez says they were mailed weeks ago, and they contained important information about my heart condition." Her face went pale, and for a moment, I thought she might confess everything. Instead, she stood up abruptly and started clearing our coffee cups, even though we weren't finished. "I think you're being paranoid, Margaret. Maybe you should talk to someone about the stress you've been under." That night, I called Jessica and filled her in on the conversation. My daughter's response was swift and decisive. "Mom, we're going to get to the bottom of this tomorrow. Something is definitely not right here." One small detail blew the whole thing open. The next morning, I woke up with a heaviness in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart condition. The conversation with Linda kept replaying in my mind. Her pale face when I mentioned the medical results, the way she deflected and tried to make me feel like I was losing my grip on reality. 24 hours ago, I would have trusted my sister with my life. Now, I wasn't sure I could trust her with my mail. Jessica arrived at my house just after 9, her usually bright demeanor replaced by a determined seriousness that reminded me of her father when he was tackling a difficult problem at work. She set her purse down on my kitchen counter with more force than necessary, the sound echoing through the quiet morning air. "All right, Mom, we're going to figure this out today," she said, pulling out her phone and a small notebook I recognized from her college days. "I've been thinking about this all night, and there are too many coincidences for this to be innocent." The morning sunlight streaming through my kitchen windows felt almost accusatory as Jessica laid out her plan. We would call Dr. Martinez's office first to get exact dates and tracking information for the mailed results, then contact the postal service to see if there had been any delivery issues to my address. The methodical approach felt both reassuring and terrifying. Because if we followed this trail and found proof that Linda had been intercepting my mail, it would change everything between us. Dr. Martinez's receptionist confirmed what I already feared. The test results had been mailed 3 weeks ago via certified mail, requiring a signature upon delivery. According to their records, the envelope had been delivered and signed for on a Tuesday morning at 10:47 a.m., a time when I had been at my weekly physical therapy appointment. "Do you remember if Aunt Linda knew about your PT schedule?" Jessica asked, her pen hovering over her notebook. The question hit me like a physical blow. Of course Linda knew. I'd mentioned it to her multiple times, complaining about how the early morning sessions were hard on my joints, but necessary for my recovery. She'd even offered to drive me a few times, though I'd always declined. preferring to maintain what little independence I had left. We spent the afternoon at the local post office, where a sympathetic supervisor confirmed that certified mail had indeed been delivered to my address and signed for by someone who had printed the name M. Chen. My name, but not in my handwriting. The signature was shaky, clearly an attempt at disguise. But I recognized the slight backward slant that Linda had developed after breaking her wrist years ago. The drive home from the post office was silent except for the rhythmic tapping of Jessica's fingers against the steering wheel. When we pulled into my driveway, I noticed Linda's car parked across the street. Something that would have seemed normal yesterday, but now felt ominous. "She's been watching the house," Jessica said quietly, voicing what I was thinking. "Mom, this is worse than we thought. She's not just taking your mail randomly, she's being strategic about it." Inside my house, I felt like a stranger in my own space. Every room seemed different now, knowing that Linda had been entering without my knowledge, going through my things, deciding what information I was allowed to have about my own health. The violation felt intimate and cruel in a way that made my hands shake as I tried to make us both tea. When Linda knocked on my front door an hour later, I almost didn't answer. Through the frosted glass, I could see her familiar silhouette, but everything about her presence felt wrong now. She was holding something in her hands, an envelope, white and official-looking. "Hi, Margaret," she said when I finally opened the door, her smile too bright, too forced. "I found this in my mailbox by mistake. Looks like the postal worker mixed up our mail again." The envelope was addressed to me, from Dr. Martinez's office, postmarked from the previous week. Linda held it out to me with hands that trembled slightly, and I noticed she'd already opened it carefully along the edge, the kind of precise opening that suggested she'd read the contents before deciding to return it. Jessica appeared beside me in the doorway, and Linda's expression shifted from nervous guilt to something approaching panic. The 3 generations of our family stood there in the afternoon shadows, the weight of unspoken truths hanging between us like a curtain that was about to be pulled away. "Aunt Linda," Jessica said, her voice steady but cold. "We need to talk about Mom's mail." "All of it." Linda's face crumpled then, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years. My sister looked genuinely afraid. Not just caught in a lie, but terrified of something deeper, something that had been driving her to these desperate actions. "Please," Linda whispered, glancing between Jessica and me. "Let me explain. You don't understand what those test results said. You don't understand what I was trying to protect you from." But as I took the envelope from her shaking hands and saw the return address from the cardiac specialist's office, I realized that whatever Linda thought she was protecting me from might be nothing compared to what she had actually done. The 3 of us moved to my living room in tense silence, Linda clutching her purse like a shield against her chest. I noticed she kept glancing toward the window as if planning an escape route. Jessica sat beside me on the couch while Linda perched on the edge of my armchair, looking smaller than I'd ever seen her. I opened the envelope with deliberate care, my heart hammering as I unfolded the letter from Dr. Martinez. The words swam before my eyes at first, then came into sharp focus. Results from my cardiac stress test. Recommendations for follow-up. A medication adjustment. Nothing catastrophic. Nothing that warranted the fear I saw etched across Linda's face. "This is just routine follow-up," I said, looking up at my sister. "Linda, what exactly did you think you were protecting me from?" Linda's hands twisted in her lap. "You don't remember how you were after Dad's heart attack? How terrified you became of every chest pain, every shortness of breath. You stopped leaving the house for weeks, Margaret. I couldn't watch you go through that again." The memory hit me like a physical blow. Our father's sudden cardiac arrest when I was 38. The months of anxiety that followed where I'd convinced myself every heartbeat was my last. But that had been 15 years ago, and I was a different person now. So, you decided to hide my medical information instead of trusting me to handle it? My voice came out sharper than I intended. Linda, that's not protection. That's control. Jessica leaned forward, her journalist instincts clearly engaged. Aunt Linda, how long has this been going on? Just Mom's medical stuff, or other mail too? The question hung in the air while Linda seemed to struggle with herself. Finally, she reached into her purse and pulled out a small stack of envelopes, all bearing my name and address. Some were weeks old. Insurance papers, she said quietly, setting them on the coffee table like confessions. Bills from specialists. A letter from your pharmacy about a medication recall. I kept thinking I'd bring them over when you seemed strong enough, but you've been so happy lately, Margaret. So content. I didn't want to ruin that. I stared at the pile of mail, my life's administrative details that had been filtered through my sister's judgment. The violation felt even deeper now, seeing the evidence of how long this had been happening. You had no right, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. These are my choices to make, my information to receive. Even if I had fallen apart, that would have been my right too. Linda's eyes filled with tears, but there was something else in her expression now. A defensiveness that made my stomach clench. I have the key because you asked me to check on things when you went to visit Jessica last Christmas, she said. And I saw how your hands shook when you got that first letter from the cardiologist. I saw how you couldn't sleep, how you stopped answering your phone. I was trying to help. By lying to me for months? Jessica's voice was ice cold. By making medical decisions for an adult woman who's perfectly capable of handling her own health? You don't live here, Linda snapped back at Jessica, and I saw a flash of something ugly cross her face. You don't see her every day. You don't know how fragile she's been. The word fragile hung between us like an accusation, and I felt something shift inside me. Not the fear Linda had been so worried about, but anger. Clean, clarifying anger. Get out, I said quietly. Linda blinked. Margaret, please, let me explain more. There's something else you need to know about why I was so worried. Something I haven't told you yet about what Dr. Martinez wrote in his notes. But I was already standing, my decision crystallizing with each word she spoke. Whatever else she was hiding, whatever other justifications she thought she had, I'd heard enough for one day. Take my key and leave it on the table. We'll talk when I'm ready, but not today. As Linda reluctantly placed my spare key next to the stack of intercepted mail, I realized this was just the beginning. The look in her eyes as she headed for the door told me she was still holding back something significant, something that had made her desperate enough to violate my privacy so completely. After the door closed behind her, Jessica and I sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, she spoke. Mom, what do you think she meant about Dr. Martinez's notes? What else could she be hiding? I picked up the stack of mail with hands that were steadier than they'd been all day. Whatever Linda thought she was protecting me from, I was about to find out for myself. But as I started opening the envelopes one by one, a chill ran down my spine at what might be waiting in the letters she'd deemed too dangerous for me to see. The late afternoon sun slanted through my living room windows, casting long shadows across the scattered envelopes that held months of my hidden medical correspondence. Jessica had made us both tea, But mine sat cooling on the coffee table as I worked through the stack with methodical determination. Each envelope I opened felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that Linda had taken without permission. The first few letters were routine follow-ups from my cardiologist, Dr. Martinez, discussing medication adjustments and scheduling for tests I'd apparently missed. But as I dug deeper into the chronological pile, the tone of his correspondence began to shift. The medical language became more urgent, more specific about timelines and treatment options. "Mom, your hands are shaking again," Jessica said gently, settling beside me on the couch. "Maybe we should take a break." "No," I said firmly, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "Linda made that decision for me once. I won't make it for myself now." The next envelope contained lab results with several values circled in red ink. Dr. Martinez's accompanying note explained that my cardiac function had declined more rapidly than expected, and he was recommending immediate consultation with a cardiac surgeon about valve replacement options. The letter was dated 3 months ago. 3 months? I'd lost 3 months of processing time, 3 months of making informed decisions about my own body. The anger that had felt so clean and righteous when I'd asked Linda to leave now mixed with something colder, more complicated. Jessica leaned closer, reading over my shoulder. "He's recommending surgery," she said quietly. "Surgery that might have been less invasive 3 months ago," I replied, scanning the technical details. "Surgery that I should have been discussing with you, with my doctors, with everyone except the one person who actually got to weigh in on it." The irony wasn't lost on me that Linda, who had no medical training beyond basic first aid, had been making healthcare decisions for someone with a master's degree in education and 40 years of managing her own life. The condescension of it stung almost as much as the betrayal. I opened another envelope, this one containing a letter that made me pause entirely. Dr. Martinez was writing to express concern that I hadn't responded to any of his previous correspondence or shown up for scheduled appointments. He was considering reaching out to my emergency contact to ensure I was all right. "Jessica, look at this date," I said, pointing to the letterhead. "This is from 2 weeks ago." He was worried enough to consider calling Linda. Jessica's face darkened. "So she knew you were missing appointments. She knew the doctor was concerned about your lack of response, and she still said nothing." The front door opened without warning, and I looked up to see Linda walking back in, her face set with that familiar expression of determined righteousness that I now recognized had been masking months of deception. "I told you to leave," I said, not moving from my position surrounded by the evidence of her interference. "I know, but I couldn't let you read those letters without understanding the full context," Linda said, hovering near the doorway as if unsure whether she'd be thrown out again. "Especially the surgical recommendations. Margaret, you have to understand why I was so scared." "Scared of what exactly?" Jessica's voice carried a sharp edge. "Scared that a grown woman might make her own medical decisions?" Linda's composure finally cracked, and tears began streaming down her cheeks. "Scared of losing her like we lost Mom?" The reference to our mother hung in the air between us. Our mother, who had died suddenly of a heart attack at 62, 2 years before Jessica was born. Linda had been 25 then, and I remembered how the shock had devastated her. How she'd thrown herself into taking care of everyone around her as a way of processing grief she couldn't otherwise handle. "Mom died of a massive heart attack with no warning," I said quietly. "This isn't the same situation, Linda. This is treatable. This is manageable, but only if I'm allowed to actually manage it." "But what if you decided against the surgery?" Linda asked, stepping further into the room despite the tension radiating from Jessica beside me. "What if you chose to just let things progress naturally?" I couldn't watch you make that choice, Margaret. I couldn't be complicit in losing you when there were options available. The confession revealed the depth of Linda's fear, but it also illuminated something else: her complete inability to trust my judgment about my own life. In her mind, I was apparently so fragile, so likely to make self-destructive choices, that she'd felt justified in removing my agency entirely. That would have been my choice to make, I said, hearing the steadiness in my voice and feeling surprised by it. Even if it was the wrong choice, even if you disagreed with it completely, it would have been mine. I picked up the most recent letter from Dr. Martinez, the one expressing concern about my non-responsiveness. Instead, what happened was that my doctor thinks I'm either ignoring his recommendations or too mentally compromised to handle correspondence. Do you understand how that reflects on me professionally, personally, medically? Linda sank into the armchair across from us, looking smaller than I'd seen her since we were children. I was going to tell you everything after I figured out how to present the options in a way that wouldn't overwhelm you. When? Jessica demanded. When exactly were you planning to stop playing God with Mom's healthcare? I don't know, Linda admitted, and the honesty of it was somehow worse than if she'd had a specific timeline. I kept thinking I'd find the right moment, the right way to explain everything without causing panic. Looking at my sister now, I realized that her need to control the situation had become its own kind of prison. She'd been carrying the weight of my medical information alone, making decisions she had no right to make, living with consequences that should have been mine to bear. But understanding her motivation didn't excuse what she'd done, and it certainly didn't mean I was ready to forgive her. There's something else, Linda said quietly, reaching into her purse. Something I haven't told you yet about why Dr. Martinez was so insistent about the surgery timeline. She pulled out one more envelope, this one clearly more recent than the others, and my heart rate picked up as I realized there were still secrets she hadn't revealed. My hands went cold as I stared at the envelope Linda held. The paper looked crisp, official, and I could see my name printed clearly across the front in what I now recognized as Dr. Martinez's office letterhead. What do you mean about the surgery timeline? I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Linda's fingers trembled slightly as she turned the envelope over. The mass they found isn't just growing. According to this latest report, it's growing faster than they initially projected. Jessica leaned forward, her protective instincts clearly kicking in despite her anger at Linda. How much faster? Fast enough that Dr. Martinez moved up his recommended surgery date by 6 weeks, Linda said, finally extending the letter toward me. He wants to see you within the next 2 weeks to discuss immediate surgical options. I took the envelope but didn't open it right away. The weight of it seemed disproportionate to its actual size, as if it contained not just words on paper, but the entire trajectory of my immediate future. When did this arrive? I asked. 3 days ago. 3 days. While I'd been going about my normal routine, worried about work deadlines and whether I needed to buy groceries, this information had been sitting in Linda's possession. 3 days of time I could have used to process, to plan, to mentally prepare. Linda, I said, and something in my tone made both her and Jessica look at me sharply. I need you to understand something. This pattern ends now, today, this minute. She nodded quickly, but I wasn't finished. I'm not talking about just the male interception. I'm talking about this entire dynamic where you decide what I can and cannot handle, where you become the gatekeeper to my own life. I finally opened the letter, scanning Dr. Martinez's carefully worded explanation of the accelerated growth rate and his revised recommendations. The medical terminology was complex, but the urgency was unmistakable. "Look at this," I said, holding up the letter. "He's asking me to call immediately to schedule a consultation." "Not in a few weeks when you figured out how to break the news gently. Immediately." Linda's face had gone pale. "I was going to tell you today. That's why I came over. But only because I cornered you about the other letters," Jessica pointed out. "If Mom hadn't figured out what you were doing, you'd still be sitting on this information, trying to decide when she was emotionally ready for it." The truth of Jessica's observation hung in the air between us. Linda opened her mouth as if to argue, then closed it again, apparently recognizing that any defense would sound hollow. I read through the letter again, this time more slowly, letting the medical details sink in. Dr. Martinez's tone was professional, but clearly concerned. He mentioned trying to reach me multiple times and expressed worry about the delay in response. "He's wondering if I received his previous communications," I said, looking up at Linda. "He's actually questioning whether there's some kind of mail delivery issue." The irony would have been funny if the situation weren't so serious. "What does this mean for the surgery itself?" Jessica asked, reading over my shoulder. "Is it more complicated now because of the delay?" I scanned the relevant section. "He says the procedure is still viable, but the window for the less invasive approach is narrowing. If we wait much longer, they'll have to consider more extensive surgical options." Linda made a small, choked sound, and when I looked at her, I saw tears starting to form in her eyes. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she whispered. "This is why I thought I needed to manage the information. I was terrified that by the time we figured out how to handle everything properly, it would be too late for the better treatment options." And there it was, the core of Linda's justification laid bare. In her mind, she'd been racing against time to protect me from exactly the scenario we now found ourselves in. But what she couldn't see was that her protection had actually contributed to creating the very situation she'd feared. "But Linda," I said gently, because despite everything, I could see her genuine anguish. "Your managing the information is part of what created this time crunch. If I'd received the first letter when I was supposed to, we'd have had those extra weeks to work with." She buried her face in her hands. I know that now. I thought I was helping, but I made everything worse." Jessica, who had been maintaining her angry protective stance, seemed to soften slightly at Linda's obvious distress. "The question now is what we do going forward." I looked at the letter again, noting Dr. Martinez's direct phone number written at the bottom in what looked like handwriting rather than standard letterhead text. "I'm going to call his office first thing tomorrow morning," I said. "I'm going to schedule the consultation, and I'm going to be completely honest about why there was a delay in my response." Linda's head snapped up. "You're going to tell him what I did?" "I'm going to tell him the truth about what happened. Yes, he needs to understand the timeline accurately to make the best medical recommendations." The prospect of having to explain to my doctor that my sister had been intercepting my medical correspondence was mortifying, but it seemed like a necessary step in regaining control of my health care. "I'll go with you to the appointment," Linda said quickly. "I can explain everything myself, take responsibility." "No," I said more firmly than I'd intended. "You won't be coming to the appointment." The words seemed to hit Linda like a physical blow, and I could see Jessica's surprise as well. "I need to rebuild my relationship with my medical team," I continued. "And I need to do that independently. I need Dr. Martinez to see me as a competent adult who can manage her own healthcare decisions." Linda looked stricken. "But what if you need support? What if there's information you miss, or questions you don't think to ask?" I held up my hand to stop her. Then that's my responsibility to figure out. That's what being an adult means. The room fell silent except for the sound of Linda's quiet breathing, which had become slightly labored with emotion. However, I said, looking directly at her, I will call you after the appointment to update you on what I learn, but only if you can promise me that you'll respect whatever decisions I make based on that information. Linda nodded eagerly. Yes, of course, I promise. Even if you disagree with my choices, even if you think I'm making a mistake. Her nod was slower this time, but she managed it. Jessica squeezed my hand. I'm proud of you, Mom. This is exactly the right approach. I felt a small surge of confidence at her words. For the first time since discovering Linda's deception, I felt like I was taking meaningful steps to reclaim my agency. But as I looked at the letter again, absorbing the urgency of Dr. Martinez's language and the implications of the accelerated timeline, a new worry began to form. Linda, I said slowly, is there anything else? Any other medical information? Any other communications from Dr. Martinez or his office that you haven't shown me? She shook her head immediately. No, that's everything medical related. Something in her phrasing made me pause. What do you mean, medical related? Linda's eyes darted away from mine, and my stomach dropped. Linda! Jessica said sharply, picking up on the same cue I had. What else is there? It's not medical, Linda said quickly. It's just some correspondence from your insurance company about coverage approvals and pre-authorization requirements for the surgical procedures. The air in the room seemed to change, becoming heavier somehow. My insurance coverage? I asked, hearing my voice rise slightly. Linda, exactly how much of my mail have you been taking? Linda's face had gone pale, and she was fidgeting with the hem of her sweater in a way that reminded me of when we were children and she'd been caught in a lie. Linda, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. I asked you a direct question. How much of my mail have you been taking? It's not like that, she said quickly. I wasn't taking all of it, just the important things that I thought might worry you unnecessarily. Jessica leaned forward in her chair. Aunt Linda, that's not an answer. Mom asked how much. Linda took a shaky breath. Maybe about 20%? Mostly medical and insurance-related items. Sometimes financial documents if they looked urgent. The words hit me like a series of physical blows. 20%. Financial documents. I felt dizzy and had to grip the arms of my chair to steady myself. Financial documents? I repeated slowly. What kind of financial documents? Bills that were past due, notices about your mortgage payment schedule, some investment account statements that showed losses during the market downturn last year. My mouth fell open. My mortgage payments? Linda, are you telling me that you've been intercepting notices about my mortgage? You were so stressed about the medical issues, Linda said, her voice becoming pleading. I didn't want you to have the additional worry about money on top of everything else. I stood up abruptly, needing to pace. The small living room suddenly felt impossibly confining. This is unbelievable, I said, running my hands through my hair. Linda, those aren't just pieces of paper. Those are my responsibilities, my obligations. If my mortgage payments were behind schedule, I needed to know that. But I was handling it, Linda said desperately. I called the bank and explained about your medical situation. They were understanding about working out a modified payment plan. I stopped pacing and stared at her. You called my bank? You spoke to them about my mortgage? I had to. The notices were getting more urgent, and I didn't want you to risk losing the house. Jessica made a sound, somewhere between a gasp and a groan. Aunt Linda, please tell me you didn't impersonate Mom to the bank. Linda's silence was answer enough. "Oh my God," I whispered, sinking back into my chair. "Linda, that's fraud. You committed fraud in my name." "I was trying to help you," Linda said, tears starting to stream down her face. "Everything I did was to help you." "I watched you struggling with the medical appointments and the treatment decisions, and I thought if I could just take some of the other burdens off your shoulders." "But they weren't your burdens to take," I said, feeling a strange combination of fury and exhaustion. "They were mine. My house, my mortgage, my responsibility." Jessica reached over and took my hand again. "Mom, we need to figure out exactly what Linda did with the bank and what the current status of your mortgage actually is." I nodded, trying to think clearly through the shock. "Linda, I need you to tell me everything. Every conversation you had with the bank, every piece of mail you intercepted, every action you took in my name." Linda wiped her eyes with a tissue. "There were 4 notices from the mortgage company over the past 3 months. The first 2 were just reminders about the payment schedule. The third one said you were 60 days behind, and the fourth one mentioned the possibility of foreclosure proceedings." My heart started racing. "Foreclosure proceedings? But I fixed it," Linda said quickly. "I called them and explained about your medical situation, and they agreed to a temporary modified payment plan. Your house isn't in danger." "What kind of modified payment plan?" Jessica asked, her voice tight with concern. "They agreed to accept smaller payments for 6 months, with the understanding that you'd catch up on the difference once your medical situation was resolved." I felt like I was drowning in information. "And what exactly did you tell them about my medical situation?" Linda looked uncomfortable again. "I told them you were undergoing cancer treatment and that the medical expenses were making it difficult to maintain your regular payment schedule." "Did you tell them you were me, or did you identify yourself as my sister?" The long pause before Linda answered told me everything I needed to know. "Linda," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "did you impersonate me to my mortgage company?" "I just wanted to protect you," she whispered back. Jessica stood up and began pacing the way I had been moments before. "This is so much worse than just hiding medical mail. Aunt Linda, you've potentially created legal problems that could affect Mom for years." I looked at Linda, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time since this whole nightmare began. She looked small and frightened, but also defiant in a way that worried me. "Is there anything else?" I asked. "Any other institutions you've contacted in my name? Any other mail you've hidden? Any other decisions you've made for me?" Linda hesitated, and in that hesitation, I saw my answer. "There's more," I said. It wasn't a question. Linda's shoulders sagged as she stared at her hands folded in her lap. The silence in my living room stretched taut, broken only by the distant hum of the refrigerator and Jessica's restless pacing. The afternoon light streaming through my windows had shifted, casting longer shadows across the hardwood floors I'd refinished myself just 2 years ago. Everything in this room represented my independence, my choices, my life, and now I was discovering how much of that had been quietly undermined. "There's your insurance," Linda finally said, her voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear her. My chest tightened. "What about my insurance?" "When you were in the hospital after your surgery, there were some billing issues. The insurance company was denying coverage for some of the procedures, saying they needed pre-authorization forms that hadn't been filed properly." Jessica stopped pacing and turned to face us, her expression darkening. "And you handled that too?" Linda nodded miserably. "The hospital billing department kept calling, and you were so sick, and I thought I could just clear it up quickly. So I called the insurance company and explained that there had been an emergency situation and that the forms couldn't have been filed in advance. I felt a cold dread settling in my stomach. Linda, my insurance company has very specific protocols. They record all their calls. I know that now, she whispered. Did you identify yourself as me to them as well? The answer was written across her face before she spoke. Yes. Jessica sank back into her chair, running her hands through her hair. Aunt Linda, do you understand that identity impersonation, even with family members, can be considered fraud? I watched Linda flinch at the word fraud, and despite my anger, I felt a stab of sympathy. She looked genuinely horrified at the implications of what she'd done. The Linda I'd grown up with had always been the rule follower, the one who returned extra change to cashiers and never jaywalked. This wasn't malicious criminality. It was misguided love taken to dangerous extremes. What was the outcome with the insurance? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. They approved the coverage for the surgery and the initial treatment, Linda said. But they said there might be additional review needed for ongoing care. My mind raced through the implications. If there were discrepancies in what Linda had told them versus my actual medical records, if they discovered that someone else had been making calls on my behalf without proper authorization, they could potentially void my coverage entirely. The medical bills for my treatment were already substantial. Without insurance, they would be financially devastating. Did you sign anything in my name? I asked, dreading the answer. Linda's hesitation told me everything. There were some forms that the hospital needed signed quickly, and you were still so groggy from the anesthesia. What kinds of forms? Billing authorization forms, and a form designating who they could discuss your medical information with. I closed my eyes, trying to process the full scope of what had been done in my name. It wasn't just the intercepted mail anymore. It was a pattern of decisions made without my knowledge or consent, each one potentially creating complications that could take months or years to untangle. I need to see everything, I said, opening my eyes and looking directly at Linda. Every piece of mail you kept from me, every document you signed, every conversation you had. I need a complete list of everyone you contacted while claiming to be me. Linda looked like she might be sick. Some of it is at my house. Then we need to go get it, Jessica said firmly. But I wasn't ready to leave yet. Something in Linda's demeanor told me we still hadn't reached the bottom of this. She was holding something back, something that made her look even more ashamed than impersonating me to the bank and insurance company. What else, Linda? I asked gently. I can see there's something else. She looked up at me with tears in her eyes, and I saw the little sister I'd helped raise after our parents died. She'd been so young then, barely 17, and I'd stepped into a parental role I'd never asked for, but had embraced completely. I'd helped her through college applications, relationship troubles, career decisions. I'd been her safety net for so long that perhaps it was inevitable she'd try to become mine, even in ways I'd never wanted. Your doctor's office called about scheduling your next appointment, she said. The 6-month follow-up that was supposed to happen next week. My heart stopped. What about it? I told them you needed to postpone because you were having some complications and weren't ready for the appointment yet. The world seemed to tilt around me. Linda, that follow-up appointment is crucial. It's to check that the cancer hasn't returned. You can't just postpone something like that. I was scared, she said, tears flowing freely now. I was so scared that they'd find something wrong, that you'd have to go through all of this again, and I thought if I could just give you more time to heal, more time to be strong. Jessica was staring at her aunt with something approaching disbelief. Aunt Linda, you can't protect someone from their own medical care. That's not protection. That's endangering her life. I felt a strange calm settling over me, the kind that comes after the worst possible news has been delivered, and there's nothing left to fear. Linda hadn't just been intercepting my mail and making financial decisions. She'd been interfering with my medical care based on her own fears and anxieties. When was that appointment supposed to be? I asked. Tomorrow, Linda whispered. The silence that followed was deafening. Tomorrow. My crucial 6-month follow-up appointment that could determine whether the cancer had returned was supposed to be tomorrow, and Linda had canceled it because she was too scared to face the possibility of bad news. I closed my eyes and tried to process this new level of interference. It was one thing to hide bills or even make financial decisions without my consent, but actively preventing me from receiving potentially life-saving medical care crossed a line I hadn't even known existed. I need to call them first thing in the morning, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Hopefully they can work me in this week, or at least soon. Mom, are you okay? Jessica asked, and I could hear the worry in her voice. She understood better than Linda did what delaying cancer follow-up care could mean. I will be, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. The anxiety that had been building since discovering Linda's deception now had a sharp edge of medical fear. What if the delay had already caused problems? What if there was something that needed immediate attention? Linda was crying harder now, her shoulders shaking. I'm so sorry. I thought I was helping. I thought if I could just give you more time to recover, to get stronger, then when you did go back, everything would be fine. I didn't want them to find anything wrong. Linda, look at me, I said, waiting until she raised her tear-stained face. I understand that you were scared. I understand that watching me go through cancer treatment was terrifying for you too, but you can't protect me by hiding things from me. You especially can't make medical decisions for me based on your fears. I know, she whispered. I know that now. I just kept thinking about when we lost Mom and Dad, how sudden it was, how we couldn't do anything to stop it. When you got sick, I felt so helpless again. I thought if I could just control some things, keep the scary stuff away from you, maybe I could keep you safe this time. Jessica moved closer to her aunt, her anger seeming to soften slightly. But Aunt Linda, you can't keep scary things away by pretending they don't exist. That just makes them scarier. I felt a deep sadness wash over me as I finally understood what had been driving Linda's behavior. She'd been operating from the same place of trauma that had shaped both our lives after our parents' car accident 20 years ago. I'd responded by becoming hyper-independent and taking control of everything I could. Linda had apparently responded by trying to create a bubble of false security, first for herself and now, disastrously, for me. We need to go to your house and get the rest of the mail, I said. Tonight. I need to see everything, and then tomorrow I need to start making phone calls to fix whatever can be fixed. Linda nodded, wiping her eyes. There are 3 boxes of mail in my spare bedroom closet. And I have a notebook where I wrote down all the calls I made and what I said. You kept notes? Jessica asked, sounding surprised. I was afraid I'd forget what I told people, Linda admitted. I didn't want to contradict myself and make things worse. Despite everything, I felt a tiny spark of appreciation for Linda's organizational skills, even in the midst of her deception. At least we'd have a roadmap of the damage. But as we prepared to leave for Linda's house, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something about the timing made my stomach clench with dread. "Hello?" I answered hesitantly. "Is this Sarah Chen?" The voice was professional, official sounding. I looked at Linda, whose face had gone completely white. There was something in her expression that told me this call was connected to her interference, and whatever it was bigger than anything she'd confessed to so far. "I'm sorry, you have the wrong number," I said quickly and hung up, my heart hammering against my ribs. The lie came so automatically that it scared me almost as much as Linda's expression. "Who was that?" Jessica asked, but her voice sounded distant, like she was speaking through water. I stared at Linda, whose face had drained of all color. In that moment, I realized that everything she'd confessed tonight was just the tip of the iceberg. There was something else, something bigger that she hadn't told us yet. "Linda!" My voice came out steady despite the chaos in my mind. "What else did you do?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together. "I can see it in your face," I continued. "That phone call, you know what it was about, don't you? What else haven't you told me?" Jessica looked between us, her teenage intuition picking up on the undercurrents. "Mom, what's going on? You look like you're about to throw up." The silence stretched between us, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I thought about all the things Linda might have done in my name. Medical appointments canceled, insurance claims denied, bills left unpaid. But the look on her face suggested something even worse. "The insurance," Linda whispered finally. "When they kept calling about the claims, asking for documentation, wanting you to come in for meetings about your continued coverage." "What did you do?" The words came out harsher than I intended. "I told them you'd moved, that you were staying with relatives in another state while you recovered. I gave them a fake forwarding address." She was speaking so quietly we had to strain to hear her. "I thought it would buy us time, that I could figure out how to handle everything without worrying you." The room felt like it was spinning. "Linda, that's insurance fraud." "I know." The words exploded out of her. "I know that now, but at the time, I was just trying to make the calls stop. You were so weak from the chemo, and they kept wanting forms signed and appointments scheduled, and I thought if I could just make it all pause until you were stronger." Jessica sat down heavily on the couch. "Mom, how could you think that was a good idea?" I found myself thinking about the person I'd been before cancer, the one who handled everything myself, who never asked for help, who prided myself on being in control. That person felt like a stranger now. This version of me, sitting in Linda's living room, discovering that my sister had potentially committed crimes in my name, felt raw and exposed and completely unprepared for adult life. "How long ago did you tell them I'd moved?" I asked. 3 months ago." Linda's voice was barely audible. "And they've been trying to verify it ever since. They've been calling the phone number I gave them, which was my old work number that's been disconnected. They've been sending investigators to the fake address." "Investigators?" Jessica's voice cracked. I closed my eyes and tried to think through the implications. Insurance fraud was a felony. Even if Linda had done it with good intentions, even if she'd been trying to protect me, she'd still committed a serious crime. And worse, she'd done it using my identity. "That phone call," I said slowly, "was probably the insurance company, or maybe even the police." Linda nodded miserably. "I've been seeing cars I don't recognize parked outside my house sometimes." I thought maybe I was being paranoid, but now? The weight of it all settled on my shoulders like a physical thing. It wasn't just the intercepted mail anymore, or even the lies to doctors and creditors. Linda had created an entirely false narrative about my life, told institutions that I was living somewhere I wasn't, provided fake addresses and phone numbers. The ripple effects could destroy both our lives. "We have to call them back," I said, "right now, before this gets any worse." "But what if they arrest me?" Linda's voice was small and scared, and for a moment she looked exactly like she had when we were children and she'd broken something valuable. "Then we'll deal with that too," I heard myself saying, though I had no idea how. "But Linda, running from this, lying more, pretending it isn't happening. That's exactly what got us here in the first place." Jessica reached over and took her mother's hand. "We'll figure it out, Mom, all of us together." I looked at my niece, so young but somehow wiser than both Linda and me in this moment, and felt a strange mix of pride and sorrow. This crisis had aged her in ways no teenager should have to experience. My phone rang again. Same number. This time, I answered on the first ring. "Hello, this is Sarah Chen." But as the voice on the other end began to speak, identifying themselves and explaining why they were calling, I realized that Linda's deception had created consequences none of us had anticipated. I held my breath as the voice introduced themselves. But instead of the stern law enforcement tone I'd been expecting, the woman sounded professional but concerned. "Ms. Chen, this is Patricia Wong from Blue Cross Customer Service. I'm calling because we've been having difficulty processing some of your recent claims, and we need to verify your current address and contact information." I felt a rush of relief mixed with dread. Not the police, but still serious. "I'm sorry for the confusion. There's been a situation with my mail that I'm just now discovering. I understand these things happen. The issue is that we have conflicting information. Your sister contacted us several months ago saying you'd moved, but when we tried to reach you at the number and address she provided, we couldn't make contact. Then we had medical providers submitting claims for services at your old address, which doesn't match what we have on file." Linda was watching my face intently, trying to read the conversation. Jessica sat frozen beside her mother. "I haven't moved," I said carefully. "I'm still at the same address I've always been at. My sister was—" I paused, trying to find words that wouldn't immediately incriminate Linda. "My sister was mistaken about my living situation." There was a pause. "I see. Well, we'll need to update your file immediately. Can you confirm your current address for me?" I rattled off my real address, while Linda covered her face with her hands. "Thank you." "Now, Ms. Chen, I do need to let you know that there have been some irregularities in your account that we'll need to investigate further. When someone provides false information about a policyholder's residence, especially when there are active medical claims involved, it can trigger certain protocols." My stomach dropped. "What kind of protocols?" "We'll need documentation proving your residency, and we may need to review any claims that were processed during the period when we had incorrect information on file. Depending on what we find, we might need to involve our fraud investigation department." I looked at Linda, who was now crying silently. Jessica had her arm around her mother's shoulders. "I understand," I said. "What do I need to do to straighten this out?" After Patricia explained the documentation requirements and gave me a case number, I hung up and sat in the heavy silence of Linda's living room. "They're not sending police tonight," I said finally. "But Linda, this is still really serious. They're opening an investigation." "I know," Linda whispered. "I'm so sorry. I thought I was helping, and I've made everything so much worse." "Mom," Jessica said gently, "why don't you tell us exactly what you told them? All of it, No more secrets. Linda took a shaky breath. When you started getting those medical bills, I called them to ask about payment plans. The woman I talked to mentioned how expensive it must be to manage medical care while dealing with a move, and I agreed. I said, yes, you'd moved. She asked for a forwarding address and phone number, and I panicked and gave her my old work information because I couldn't think of anything else. But why? I asked, though I was beginning to understand. Because I thought if they believed you'd moved, they'd stop sending bills to your house. I thought maybe they'd assume you were getting settled in a new place and give you more time to pay. I thought I could buy you time to figure out the money situation without you having to worry about it. It was such a Linda solution. Complicated, well-intentioned, and disastrously short-sighted. The bills would have kept coming anyway, I said softly. They would have just forwarded them to wherever they thought I was living. I know that now. But at the time, I just wanted to make the immediate problem stop. I wanted you to have one less thing to stress about. Jessica looked between us. So what happens now? I thought about the case number Patricia had given me, about the documentation I'd need to gather, about the investigation that would determine whether Linda faced any real consequences. Now we fix it, I said. We gather every piece of mail you took, every bill, every document. We make a complete timeline of what happened when. And we're completely honest with the insurance company about what went wrong. What if they pressed charges against Mom? Jessica's voice was small. Then we'll deal with that too. But Jessica, your mom made a mistake, a big one, but she didn't set out to commit fraud. She was trying to help, even if she went about it in completely the wrong way. That has to count for something. Linda looked up at me through her tears. You're not going to cut me out of your life? The question hit me harder than I expected. Despite everything, despite the months of intercepted mail and the lies and the potential legal trouble, Linda was still my sister. She was still the person who'd helped me move into my first apartment, who'd stayed up with me in the hospital when I'd had my appendix out, who'd called me every week for 20 years just to check in. No, I said, I'm not going to cut you out. But Linda, things have to change. You can't make decisions about my life without asking me. You can't lie to people on my behalf, and you definitely can't commit crimes, even small ones, even ones you think will help me. I promise, Linda said immediately. I'll never do anything like this again. And I need you to understand that I'm an adult. When I have problems, financial or medical or otherwise, they're mine to solve. You can offer advice, you can offer support, but you can't take over. Linda nodded emphatically. I understand. I do. Looking at my sister and my niece, both of them scared and sorry and hoping for forgiveness, I realized something I probably should have figured out years ago. Linda's need to fix everything, to manage everyone else's problems, wasn't really about helping people. It was about her own anxiety, her own need to feel in control of situations that scared her. Linda, I said, I think maybe you should talk to someone, a counselor or therapist, about why you feel like you need to manage everyone else's life. You think I'm crazy? I think you're anxious, and I think you've been dealing with that anxiety by trying to control things you can't actually control. It's not crazy, but it's not healthy either, for you or for the people around you. Jessica squeezed her mother's hand. I think that's a good idea too, Mom. You've been so stressed about everything for so long. We spent the next 2 hours going through everything. Linda brought out the box of intercepted mail, and we sorted it chronologically. Bills, appointment reminders, insurance statements, prescription notices, even a few personal letters from friends. Months of my life that Linda had been managing without my knowledge. Some of it was fixable. I could call my doctor's office and update them on which appointments I'd actually missed versus which ones Linda had rescheduled. I could contact the billing department at the hospital and work out actual payment plans instead of the confusing mix of deferrals and promises Linda had negotiated. But some of it would have lasting consequences. My credit report would show late payments that I'd never even known I owed. The insurance investigation would be on my record regardless of the outcome. And the trust between Linda and me would take time to rebuild. As I drove home that night, my car full of mail that should have been delivered to me months ago, I thought about boundaries and family and the complicated ways we try to take care of each other. Linda had been wrong, deeply and seriously wrong. But she'd also been trying to protect me from stress and worry during a difficult time in my life. The road to disaster, I realized, really was paved with good intentions. Over the next few weeks, I worked methodically through the mess Linda had created. I sent documentation to the insurance company, made payment arrangements with various medical providers, and slowly untangled the web of white lies and misdirection my sister had woven around my life. The insurance company ultimately decided not to pursue fraud charges against Linda, determining that while her actions were inappropriate, they didn't rise to the level of intentional fraud. But I had to attend 2 formal meetings to provide statements and documentation, and Linda had to write a detailed explanation of her actions. More importantly, Linda did start seeing a counselor. It turned out that her need to manage everyone else's problems was rooted in anxiety that had been building for years, made worse by her divorce and her worry about Jessica's future. Jessica, for her part, seemed relieved that the family secret was finally out in the open. She started calling me directly instead of going through Linda, and I made an effort to include her more in my life without Linda as an intermediary. The whole experience taught me something important about family relationships and boundaries. It's possible to love someone deeply and still refuse to enable their harmful behavior. It's possible to forgive someone and still insist that they change. If you're dealing with a family member who's overstepping boundaries, even with good intentions, don't ignore it hoping it will get better on its own. Address it directly, set clear limits, and be prepared to enforce those limits, even when it's uncomfortable. Family relationships require the same respect and boundaries as any other relationship. Love doesn't mean letting people manage your life for you, and helping doesn't mean taking over someone else's responsibilities. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to let someone else's anxiety become your crisis.